everyone wanted to sleep with him. He was so attractive and so talented. I could understand. He was Mick Jagger. What can you say? But, I mean, now I think, everything worked out the way it should have.
For over 2 decades, Jerry Hall stood beside one of the most risky men in rock and roll, and she paid for it with heartbreak that took years to admit out loud. Behind the glamorous photos, the 4 children, and the fairy tale wedding in Bali, there was betrayal after betrayal, a marriage that wasn't even legal, and a scandal so public it ended everything overnight. Jerry Hall finally opened up about what really happened behind closed doors with Mick Jagger, and the truth is far messier than the headlines ever let on. Here's what she revealed. Cracks beneath the surface. Throughout the 1990s, even as Hall and Jagger continued to present themselves as a committed married couple, the cracks in their relationship were widening. Hall has since spoken candidly about the toll that Jagger's infidelities took on her over the years, not as a single betrayal, but as a recurring pattern that she found herself confronting again and again, sometimes years apart, sometimes uncomfortably close together, each time reopening wounds she thought she had already dealt with. In interviews given long after the relationship ended, Hall described a marriage defined by cycles, periods of genuine happiness and family stability, interrupted repeatedly by revelations of Jagger's affairs. Each time, according to her accounts, she was faced with the same impossible choice: walk away from the father of her children and the life they had built, or try once more to make it work. She has talked about the private toll this took on her sense of self-worth, describing moments of humiliation that played out not just privately, but in a media landscape that seemed to delight in tracking every rumor, publishing speculation about her marriage almost as often as they covered Jagger's music. She chose to stay, time and again, for years. Part of that, she has suggested, came from genuine love and commitment to the family unit they had created. Part of it may have come from the sheer public weight of their relationship. Ending things wouldn't just be a private heartbreak. It would be a headline. Every argument, every reconciliation, every rumor of trouble was fodder for entertainment coverage that showed no signs of losing interest in their marriage. And Hall has admitted that the pressure of a very public relationship made walking away feel far more complicated than it might have been for an ordinary couple facing the same betrayals in private. Jagger, for his part, has rarely spoken in detail about the specifics of what went wrong between them. His public reputation as a serial womanizer, cultivated since his earliest days of fame, meant that infidelity rumors surrounding him were almost a permanent fixture of his image. So much so that even Hall herself may have initially underestimated just how severe and how personally devastating the pattern would eventually become. Some who knew the couple during this period have suggested that Jagger's charm and charisma, the very qualities that made him a global icon, were also what allowed the relationship to survive as long as it did, even through repeated betrayals that might have ended other marriages far sooner. There were, according to Hall, specific moments during this decade that nearly ended the relationship long before 1999 actually did. She has alluded to confrontations that pushed her to the brink of leaving, only to be pulled back by promises of change, by the children's needs, or simply by the exhaustion of imagining what starting over would look like after so many years invested in one man and one family. Each near ending, she has suggested, made the eventual real ending both more inevitable and, in some ways, more painful when it finally arrived. By the late 1990s, after roughly 2 decades together, the strain had reached a breaking point, and this time, it wouldn't be a rumor Hall could quietly absorb and move past. So what finally pushed things past the point of no return? The golden couple begin. In the mid-1970s, Jerry Hall was already one of the most recognizable faces in the world. The Texas-born model had graced magazine covers across Europe, walked for the biggest designers, and carried herself with a kind of effortless, sun-drenched confidence that made photographers fight to work with her. Raised in Mesquite, Texas, one of 5 sisters, Hall had left small-town life behind as a teenager to chase modeling work in Paris. arriving with almost nothing but ambition and quickly landing contracts that most young women in the industry could only dream of. Within a few years, she was one of the highest-paid models in the world, a fixture at fashion shows in Paris, Milan, and New York. By the mid-1970s, she was engaged to Bryan Ferry, the smooth-voiced frontman of Roxy Music, and by most accounts, her life was already the stuff most people only dream about. A rising career, a famous partner, and a level of fame that most models of her era never reached. Then, Mick Jagger entered the picture. The Rolling Stones frontman was, by 1977, already a global phenomenon, the strutting, sneering face of a band that had redefined what rock stardom could look like. He was magnetic, unpredictable, and famously difficult to pin down. Jagger had already lived an entire lifetime of fame by the time he met Hall, having spent more than a decade as one of the most scrutinized men in music. His personal life just as newsworthy as his performances, and his reputation for chaos following him wherever he went. When Jagger and Hall's paths crossed, the attraction was immediate, and according to those close to the situation, impossible to ignore. Their romance became public knowledge quickly, and the fallout was messy from the very beginning. Hall's engagement to Ferry collapsed in the process, a scandal in its own right that tabloids devoured for months, complete with accusations of betrayal on all sides and public statements from Ferry expressing his hurt over the situation. But Hall and Jagger pressed forward anyway. For the next several years, they became one of the most photographed couples on the planet. Wherever the Rolling Stones toured, Hall was often nearby, glamorous, composed, seemingly unbothered by the chaos that surrounded a man like Jagger. Paparazzi trailed them at airports, restaurants, and backstage at sold-out arenas, and magazine editors quickly realized that a cover featuring the two of them together practically guaranteed newsstand sales. To the outside world, they looked like the ultimate power couple, the wild rock star and the statuesque supermodel, both larger than life, both seemingly built for exactly this kind of spotlight. What the public didn't see, at least not yet, was the pattern that had already started to form. Jagger's reputation as a womanizer wasn't a secret. His history with other high-profile partners, including his previous marriage to Bianca Jagger, had already made headlines for infidelity, and stories of his behavior on tour were practically industry legend among music journalists who covered the Stones. Hall herself has since reflected that part of what drew her to Jagger in the first place was precisely the danger everyone warned her about. In later interviews, she described him as unlike anyone she had ever met, someone who could walk into a room and completely rearrange the energy in it, for better or worse. That magnetism, she has said, made the early warning signs easy to rationalize away. It's a common thread in Hall's retrospective interviews. She rarely claims she was blindsided by who Jagger was. Instead, she describes a slow, willing surrender to a version of love that she knew, even then, came with a cost attached. Hall knew, by most accounts, exactly who she was getting involved with. She simply believed, as many do in the early rush of a relationship, that things would be different with her. They wouldn't be. But it would take years and a great deal of heartbreak before Hall was willing to admit that out loud. So how did two people so aware of the risks end up building an entire family together anyway? That's where things get complicated. Building a family, pity amid rumors. Friends who observed the relationship during those early years often remarked on how inseparable they seemed in public. Hall appeared convinced that beneath Jagger's rebellious reputation was a man capable of settling down. For a while, that belief seemed justified, making what came later all the more heartbreaking. By the early 1980s, Jerry Hall and Mick Jagger were operating as a de facto family, even without a marriage certificate to formalize it. Their first child, Elizabeth Jagger, was born in 1984, followed by James in 1985. Two more children, Georgia in 1992 and Gabriel in 1997, would eventually round out their family of 6. Each new addition to the family brought fresh waves of media attention, with photographers camping outside hospitals, and family homes, hoping to capture the first images of each child. And each birth was treated as a major entertainment news event in its own right. For years, Hall and Jagger lived a life that blended domesticity with the chaos of Jagger's ongoing career. When the Rolling Stones toured, Hall and the children would often travel with him for stretches, trying to maintain some version of a normal family unit inside an inherently abnormal lifestyle. School lessons conducted in hotel suites, birthdays celebrated in different countries, bedtime routines squeezed in between sound checks and press events. Friends and family described Hall as devoted to creating stability for her children, even as her partner's schedule, fame, and temptations made that an uphill battle. She reportedly took great pains to shield the children from the more chaotic aspects of touring life, insisting on routines and boundaries even when the surrounding environment made that difficult. And she has said in later interviews that motherhood gave her a sense of purpose that helped her endure the harder parts of the relationship. And the rumors never really stopped. Throughout the 1980s, whispers about Jagger's behavior on tour circulated regularly in gossip columns and entertainment press. Musicians on the road for months at a time have long been subject to speculation, fair or not. But with Jagger, the rumors carried a particular weight. His history made them believable. And according to Hall's own later accounts, believable often meant true. Tabloids would print unconfirmed sightings of Jagger with other women in cities across Europe and America. And while some of these stories were undoubtedly exaggerated for headlines, Hall has since suggested that far too many of them turned out to be accurate, forcing her to develop a kind of practiced composure whenever a new rumor surfaced. Still, Hall stayed. In interviews given years later, she would describe her reasoning candidly. She loved him. She was building a life and a family with him, and she held on to hope that things would eventually settle. She wasn't naive about who Jagger was. She understood the risks of loving a rock star whose entire public persona was built on rebellion and excess. What she may not have fully anticipated was just how personally those risks would eventually cost her, or how many separate times she would have to make the same painful decision to forgive and continue, each time hoping it might finally be the last. Hall has also reflected on the particular isolation of going through this in the public eye. Unlike an ordinary partner facing similar betrayals, she couldn't quietly confide in friends without word eventually leaking to the press, and she couldn't process her feelings privately without reporters camped outside her home looking for a reaction shot. She's described developing a kind of survival instinct during these years, learning to present a composed face for the cameras regardless of what was happening behind closed doors, a skill that came at a real emotional cost over time. By the end of the 1980s, after roughly a decade together and 2 children already born, Hall and Jagger made a decision that would come to define and complicate the rest of their relationship. They decided to get married, but the wedding itself would end up being almost as controversial as the marriage it was meant to celebrate. The Bali wedding. In November 1990, Jerry Hall and Mick Jagger traveled to Bali, Indonesia, for what both of them, and much of the world, believed was their wedding day. The ceremony was intimate, exotic, and dripping with the kind of romantic mythology that tabloids loved. A rock star and a supermodel exchanging vows on a tropical island, surrounded by lush scenery and traditional touches, sealing more than a decade of on-again, off-again devotion. Photographs from the event show a radiant Hall and a visibly happy Jagger. And at the time, the ceremony was widely reported as the real, official union of 2 of the world's most famous people, splashed across magazine covers as proof that the couple had finally made things official. For years afterward, Hall and Jagger referred to themselves publicly as husband and wife. They wore the label in interviews, in official appearances, and in how they discussed their family. Hall spoke openly about her husband in press conferences and magazine profiles, and Jagger, for his part, rarely corrected the characterization. As far as either of them seemed to understand at the time, they were legally married, and their children were, in the eyes of both parents and the public, born to a wedded couple. There was just one enormous problem: they weren't. The ceremony performed in Bali did not meet the legal requirements to be recognized as a valid marriage under Indonesian law, nor had the couple completed the necessary paperwork to have it legally recognized elsewhere, such as in the United Kingdom, where they primarily resided. For nearly a decade, this fact sat quietly in the background, unnoticed or perhaps conveniently ignored. While Hall and Jagger continued living as a married couple in every practical sense, filing joint appearances, raising their children under a shared household, and presenting a united front to the outside world at galas, premieres, and family functions alike. The truth wouldn't surface in a meaningful way until the relationship itself was already collapsing. And when it did, it would become one of the most consequential legal technicalities of Jagger's public life. Because when things eventually fell apart between them, Jagger's legal team would use the invalidity of that Bali ceremony as a central argument, effectively stating that Hall had never been his legal wife at all, and therefore was not entitled to the same protections a legally married spouse would have under UK or international law. For Hall, discovering that her marriage, the one she had believed in and built a family around for years, held no legal weight, was reportedly a gutting realization. It wasn't just a technical loophole. It represented, in her later accounts, one more way in which the relationship's foundation had been unstable all along, even when it looked, from the outside, like the real thing. She has described feeling as though an entire decade of her identity as a wife had been quietly built on sand, and that the discovery forced her to reconsider parts of her past she had never thought to question. Adding to the sting was the fact that the invalidity of the wedding wasn't some obscure legal footnote Hall stumbled upon privately. It became public knowledge, debated in newspapers and legal columns around the world. Commentators and lawyers weighed in on what the ruling meant for celebrity marriages more broadly, turning Hall's personal heartbreak into a case study cited in family law circles for years afterward. For a woman who had spent nearly a decade calling herself a wife in front of cameras, watching that identity dissected as a legal technicality in the press was, by her own account, one of the more surreal indignities of the entire ordeal. But the invalid wedding wasn't the injury that finally ended things. So what was it that finally broke them? The betrayal that ended everything. In 1999, the relationship between Jerry Hall and Mick Jagger reached its final irreversible collapse, and the cause was impossible to ignore. Jagger had fathered a child with Brazilian model Luciana Morad, and the news broke publicly in a way that left Hall with no room to look the other way, no matter how many times she may have done so in the past. The story dominated headlines for weeks, with details of the affair, the pregnancy, and Jagger's initial denials all playing out under intense media scrutiny, turning what might have once been a private matter into an international spectacle. This wasn't a rumor whispered in gossip columns. It was confirmed, undeniable, and it produced a child, a fact that made reconciliation, or even quiet forgiveness, essentially impossible. For Hall, who had spent years absorbing infidelity after infidelity in service of keeping her family together, this was the betrayal that finally broke the marriage beyond repair. Those close to Hall at the time described her as devastated, not just by the affair itself, but by the fact that it had produced tangible, permanent proof that could no longer be dismissed or minimized the way earlier rumors had been. Hall filed for divorce shortly afterward, and it was at this point that the earlier legal ambiguity around their 1990 Bali wedding suddenly became critically important. Jagger's legal team argued that because the Balinese ceremony had never been legally valid, Hall was not entitled to the same rights or settlement she might have expected from a legitimate marriage. It was a devastating one-two punch. Not only had her partner fathered a child with another woman, but the very marriage she believed had defined the last decade of her life was, in the eyes of the law, essentially meaningless. Hall has since described this period as one of the most painful of her life. Not just the infidelity itself, but the compounded humiliation of learning that her legal standing as Jagger's wife had never actually existed. She had built an identity, in part, around being his wife. Discovering that identity had no legal foundation at the exact moment her family was falling apart added a layer of betrayal that went beyond the affair itself. She has spoken about feeling as though she had to grieve two losses simultaneously: the end of her marriage and the realization that the marriage technically had never existed at all. Eventually, Hall and Jagger reached a private settlement, avoiding a prolonged legal battle over the marriage's validity. The details were never fully made public, but the resolution allowed both parties to move forward separately after more than 2 decades together, and allowed Hall to retain significant financial security despite the legal complications surrounding the marriage's legitimacy. Still, Hall has said that no financial settlement could fully account for what she felt she'd lost. The children were teenagers and young adults by this point, old enough to understand what was happening and to feel the fallout themselves. Hall has spoken about the difficulty of managing her own grief while also trying to help her children process the public unraveling of the only family structure they had ever known, all while tabloids continued printing new details about the Morad scandal on a near-weekly basis. The public breakup made headlines around the world. But what happened next, how Hall actually rebuilt her life, is where her story takes a turn nobody expected. Picking up the pieces. In the aftermath of her split from Jagger, Jerry Hall didn't retreat from public life. She rebuilt it, deliberately and on her own terms. She continued working, took on acting roles on stage and screen, including West End theater productions, and remained a visible, respected figure in fashion and entertainment circles long after her modeling heyday had technically ended. In 2016, she married media mogul Rupert Murdoch, stepping into an entirely different kind of high-profile partnership, one defined more by business and stability than the rock and roll chaos of her previous marriage. That relationship placed Hall at the center of an entirely new social world, one built around media empires, political influence, and boardrooms rather than concert tours and recording studios. That relationship, too, would eventually end in divorce, announced in 2022, closing another chapter of Hall's very public romantic history. Throughout these years, Hall gradually became more open about her past with Jagger, offering glimpses into the emotional reality behind the glamorous headlines. She's spoken about the specific pain of the infidelities, the confusion and hurt of learning her marriage was never legally binding, and the complicated grief of ending a relationship that had defined more than 20 years of her life and produced 4 children she deeply loved. In several interviews, she has reflected on how long it took her to fully process what had happened, admitting that public perception of her as unbothered or glamorous often masked years of private pain that she rarely discussed even with close friends. But her reflections haven't been solely focused on pain. Hall has also been candid about the more complicated truth of her history with Jagger, that alongside the betrayals, there were also years of genuine connection, and that Jagger, whatever his failures as a partner, has, by most of Hall's own accounts, been a present and caring father to their children. She has credited him with showing up consistently for school events, birthdays, and major milestones, even during the most difficult periods of their relationship, and has said that his commitment to fatherhood never wavered, even as the romantic relationship deteriorated. Hall has also spoken about the adjustment of redefining herself outside the identity she'd held for over 2 decades. For most of her adult life, she had been known publicly as one half of one of the world's most famous couples, rebuilding a sense of self apart from that, as a single mother, then eventually as Rupert Murdoch's wife, and later as simply Jerry Hall on her own terms, was, by her own account, a slower and more difficult process than the public divorce headlines ever suggested. This nuance is part of what makes Hall's account of the relationship so compelling to look back on. She hasn't painted Jagger as a cartoonish villain, nor has she pretended the pain wasn't real. Instead, her retrospective comments describe a relationship that was simultaneously loving and deeply flawed, capable of producing a family she cherishes, while also inflicting wounds that took years and multiple painful revelations to fully process. So after everything, the affairs, the invalid marriage, the very public divorce, how did Jerry Hall and Mick Jagger end up here? An unexpected peace. Decades removed from the scandal that ended their marriage, Jerry Hall and Mick Jagger have settled into a relationship defined not by bitterness, but by a surprisingly amicable co-parenting dynamic. With 4 adult children and multiple grandchildren between them, Hall has spoken in more recent interviews about how she and Jagger have found common ground in their shared role as parents and grandparents, gathering together for holidays and family milestones in a way that would have seemed almost impossible during the height of their breakup. According to Hall's own accounts, Jagger remains an active presence in the lives of their grandchildren, showing up not as the distant rock star of his public image, but as an engaged family figure who makes time between tours and recording sessions to be present for the people who matter most. For a couple whose split once dominated entertainment headlines around the world, this later life piece represents a striking contrast to the pain that defined their final years together, and stands as proof that even the messiest breakups can eventually soften with time. Hall has suggested that time and the shared experience of watching their children grow into adults with families of their own played a significant role in softening old wounds. What once felt unforgivable in the immediate aftermath of the Morad scandal has, over decades, evolved into a working relationship built on mutual respect for the family they created together, even if the romantic chapter of their story ended in heartbreak. She has said that seeing Jagger as a grandfather, rather than as the partner who once broke her trust, has allowed her to view their shared history with more compassion than she once thought possible. Hall has also pointed out that this peace didn't arrive overnight. It took years of careful, sometimes awkward, co-parenting, shared holidays, coordinated schedules around each child's milestones, and a mutual decision by both parties to prioritize their children's well-being over lingering resentment. She described it less as forgiveness in a single dramatic moment, and more as a gradual thaw that neither of them could have predicted in the immediate aftermath of the divorce. For Hall, that slow thaw has become its own quiet victory, proof that even the most public, painful endings can eventually give way to something calmer. It's a reminder that public narratives, the scandal, the infidelity, the legal battle over an invalid marriage, often capture only the most dramatic chapters of a much longer, more complicated story. Hall's willingness to speak honestly about both the damage and the love that coexisted throughout her relationship with Jagger has given the public a rare, layered look at what actually happens behind the glossy photographs of a celebrity power couple, stripped of the glamour that once defined how the world saw them. Her story isn't one of simple villains or simple victims. It's the story of 2 people who built a family together, hurt each other deeply, and eventually found a way to coexist peacefully once the dust of their very public breakup finally settled. Jerry Hall's story with Mick Jagger is a reminder that behind every glamorous headline, there's usually a far messier, far more human reality, one of love, betrayal, resilience, and eventually an unlikely peace. Her willingness to be honest about the hardest parts of her past, rather than hiding behind the polished image the public expected of her, is what makes her story so relatable. Decades after it first made headlines, and it's a rare thing to see a public figure speak with this much candor about a relationship that once defined her entire public identity. Few celebrities are willing to revisit their most painful chapters this openly, which is exactly what makes Hall's perspective so valuable for anyone trying to understand the real cost of love lived in the public eye. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe for more untold celebrity stories just like this one, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. And let me know in the comments, did Jerry Hall make the right choice by staying with Mick for as long as she did? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.